Hi everybody, Peggy McGuire here for English 106, and today our topic is going to be what we do next after we have written a proposal to do some work. That proposal has been accepted and now you have gone ahead and done the work. What you are going to be doing is writing a formal report on what you have done. So I think of it in terms of telling your reader what you did, what you learned because of what you did, and what you recommend based on what you did. So that is what goes into a business research report, which we will discuss today. Okay, so just some general guidelines about writing reports, some general information about organization of a report of this kind, and then I'll get into the sort of nitty-gritty of the parts of the report and what each one does. So, overall, this shouldn't surprise you all, that a good, effective report on a project that you have completed will, first of all, clearly define what the problem is that you were focusing on. What question were you trying to answer? What issue were you trying to resolve? What question were you trying to come up with recommendations about how to answer? So, clearly defining the problem that's being focused on, or remember we use the term opportunity a lot, clearly defining the opportunity that you were focusing on in the work that you did. So that's the first thing that makes a good report. The second thing, leading right from that, is once you've clearly defined the problem or the opportunity, your report also contains a wealth of information about that problem or opportunity that you have found by doing good, solid research. So the information speaks for itself. It shows that you have done good, creditable research. It also shows that once you have gathered that information, that you have carefully analyzed it. You have thought about the question you're trying to answer, the problem you're trying to solve. You've looked at your data, and you've carefully thought about the data in light of the problem you're focusing on, the opportunity you're trying to pursue. Okay, so that's what we mean by that careful analysis. You think of the question you're trying to answer, you look at the data in light of that question, and try to figure out what's what. That's good analysis. All right? So, that's the work you've done. Now, the report itself, to be good, is going to be well written, clear, concise, well organized. So all of that information and all of the conclusions you draw from it are organized into a report whose writing is nice and clear and easy to read. And the document itself is clean. The design engages the reader rather than distracting, makes the reader feel good rather than feeling annoyed if there's a lot of like mechanical errors or graphics that don't make any sense. You don't want any of that stuff. So the report itself, the actual deliverable term we've been using, is well written and it looks nice. Those are two really important and related things. Okay, so you've got all this information that you gathered through your exhaustive, careful research. So now you ask yourself questions in order to decide how to craft your report. And the first question is, of all this information that we've looked at, we've thought about, we've talked about, we've analyzed, what kind of information does the audience most need in order to make a decision, in order to decide if your recommendations work for me, in order to decide whether or not the solution you came up with is a good solution to the problem? What kind of information do you need to provide so that your audience can make a good decision? And then, not only what kind of information, but how much information. And we've talked about this before. Remember that this is about audience resistance, the level of audience resistance. So if you think the person reading this report is not going to be happy with your recommendations or your solution, then it's likely that you would need to provide more explanation and more evidence in order to persuade the reader to accept your recommendations. If you're already thinking that the reader's going to agree with you and be pleased with what you've come up with, then you don't need to spend so much time convincing. Okay? So the more resistance, the more information, the more evidence you want to use to fully persuade your reader to take your recommendations. Okay? I've thought about my information, what information I'm going to use, how much information I'm going to use. Now, where does that information go? And the information that you describe, that you've brought out through from research, goes into the body of your report if the following is true. If the information itself is critical to the point that you are trying to make. So you have to make that decision. Is this information critical to me making the point that I'm trying to make? If so, it goes in the body of the report. Is this information that my most significant audience will want to see there? Do I know my audience well enough to answer that question? If so, then it goes in the body of the report. And is this information relatively brief and concise? Is it short? Then it can go in the body. If your information does not fit one of those 3 bullet points, then it's not going to go into the body of the report. It may be information that you really think your audience is going to want to see, or do you feel is pretty important, but doesn't fit one of those bullet points, then you're going to have another use for it. And we'll talk about this a little more further on. But you're going to put that information into a document that we call an appendix, and that you actually attach to the body of the report. So we'll talk about that later. But here, notice, again, decision making all the way along here. When it comes to writing a formal document of this type, you are constantly making decisions. And up front, you're making decisions about what information, how much information, and where to put it. More decisions to come. As in the next one. Okay, I know which information, how much, where I'm going to put it. Now, what kind of organizational scheme makes this information the easiest for my audience to understand and to use, right? This is a very utilitarian document. Somebody wants this information because they want you to do something with it. So, what organizational method can I use to communicate this information so that it's the easiest possible to understand and to use? Some general answers to that question. Always organize your ideas before you present them. Make sure you have answered that question and you've decided what's going to come first, what's going to come next, what's going to come after that. If there's a lot of information and a lot of ideas or concepts that you need to communicate in your report, you need to group them somehow. You can't just say this. You can't just list one thing after another. It'll drive your reader crazy and she or he will lose interest. So instead, if you've got a lot of separate pieces of information to communicate, you need to group them somehow into categories. And just sort of like the thumbnail is no more than 7 categories. So just make sure that you're thinking in terms of organizing information in a way that you're not going to lose the interest or the attention of your reader. Okay? And these key ideas, or these key categories of ideas, go into the overview of your report. And not only do you say what we're going to discuss, which key topics, key ideas we're going to discuss, but the order in which we are going to discuss them in the rest of the report. So that overview really becomes a roadmap for the rest of the report. You're telling me what ideas you're going to discuss, and you're going to tell me what order they're being discussed in. So I have no question about what the rest of the report is going to look like. No surprises. Now, let's think about recommendations in particular. Let's think about if the goal of writing this report is to present a series of recommendations to the audience based on the research you did. There are several ways you can do that. And you get to choose which one will best work in your particular situation for the kind of argument you're trying to make. So, here are just several different strategies you can use, and you might use some combination of them, but think about what strategy do I want to use to present my recommendations. So here are some examples. First of all, you could say, here's a recommendation, here's a recommendation, and here's a recommendation. So there are 3 different recommendations. Now what I'm going to do is compare them to each other. I'm going to tell you all the alternatives, compare them to each other, and then tell you which one I think is best. So that's the comparison contrast method, where you tell me all 3, you say how they're the same, how they're different, and which one's best. Okay? Pro-con, you all should be fairly familiar with, but it has a similar structure in which you take each of your alternative recommendations, but you look at, for each one, you look at the pros and the cons of each one. So here's my recommendation. Here's the ways that it's a strong one. Here's the way that it might have some flaws. Here's my second possible recommendation. Here's where it might be strong. Here's where it might be weak. Here's the third recommendation. Here's the way it could be strong. Here's the way it might be weak. Now, having looked at the pros and cons of all 3, we suggest that you choose number 2, for instance. All right? So that's the pro-con strategy. Present each alternative, present arguments for and against it, and then say which one is best. All right? Problem solution, again, should be a fairly familiar structure for you now, because a lot of the writing you do takes this form, and that is, if you have identified a problem, you identify it, you discuss why it's serious and needs to be dealt with now, you try to identify its causes, and then you look at possible solutions and analyze the advantages and disadvantages of each, and then based on all of that, you make your recommendation. So, identify the problem, talk about why it's serious, identify the causes of the problem, talk about possible solutions of the problem, and then make your recommendation. That's your basic problem-solving mode. But, again, there are other alternatives, other strategies you can use for whatever you feel comfortable with. So, you could do what we call the eliminate alternatives strategy. So that's why you think about all the recommendations that somebody could make. Let's choose 3 that you could make, and you order them in terms of which one you think is the most practical, and then work backwards. So go to the end of the line, and you describe the alternative, but then you say why it won't work. Then you go to the next one in line, describe it, and say why it won't work. And you end with what you think will work. So you describe it and say, that's why this one is the best choice. Right? So, take each thing that you don't want to recommend, show why it won't work, and then get to what you do want to recommend and show why it will. Another similar strategy, a little differently structured, is what we call the SWOT analysis. So, here is a possible recommendation for what you should do. Here is a possible solution to your problem. Now I'm going to talk about the strengths of that possible solution, the weaknesses of that possible solution, the opportunities that that possible solution may present, and the threats to you that the possible alternative might present. And by doing that with each of your alternatives, it becomes pretty clear which one seems to have the greatest number of strengths, the fewest weaknesses, what provides the greatest opportunity and the least threat, which is what you want in a good recommendation, a good alternative. Okay? Okay. whichever one of those strategies you choose to lay out your recommendations at the end of your report, what you always want to do is by opening the report by explaining what decision needs to be made. Right? That goes back to what we said earlier about clearly identifying the problem. You always up front do a clear explanation of what is this question we're trying to answer. What is this problem we're trying to resolve? So, same thing here. If you're going to be making recommendations, you always start by saying, well, what decision has to be made by my audience? And explain it. The next thing you need to do, and this is happening in the body, and we'll talk a little more about this later, but in the body, once you explain the decision to be made, then you're going to list the alternatives that you will discuss. Remember that one of them may be to do nothing, right? Sometimes people ask for recommendations about what to do, and your answer is going to be don't do anything, or don't do anything right now to delay action, based on what you learned through your research. But once again, what we're talking about here is organizing in such a way that you clearly describe to me what the problem is or what decision has to be made, and then you tell me what alternatives for how to solve the problem you're going to discuss. And here's a tricky third part that's really important, but sometimes tricky to think about. You also have to explain to me what your criteria are for what will make the best alternative. And in business, I've said this many times, in business, often the best choice is going to be the one that costs the least money, that takes the least amount of time, that hurts you the least, right? Now, you can take a positive spin on that and say that this will be the most efficient way to do what you need to do. This will be the most cost-effective way, but often when we're thinking about what makes the best alternative, when there's a problem to be solved, it's going to be about some combination of time, money, and resources. So, along with making your company look good. So, what's going to best maintain your image in the community, for instance. But whatever it is, you're the only one who can answer the question because you're dealing with a particular situation and a particular context. So within that context, not only what would be the best recommendation for action or not action, but why? What makes that the best recommendation? What am I thinking about when I'm thinking about what will be best as a recommendation? So make sure that you make that clear in your argument. When do you make your recommendations? Do you do it at the beginning of the report? Do you do it at the end of the report? Well, the answer is, as it often is, it depends on your audience. Some people like to know right up front what the purpose of this report is, what your bottom line is. They want to know right up front what the answer to the question is. And hopefully you know your audience well enough to know whether or not that's who they are. And once again, to some extent, that has to do with resistance level. If you think people are going to be generally happy or satisfied with what you've come up with, then you can probably do the upfront statement of what you recommend. But if you think your audience may not be happy with your recommendations, may offer some resistance, then you may, and I underline may, want to delay an actual statement of your recommendations until the end of the report, because then you've had a chance to present all your evidence to show how much research you've done and how much you've learned about the issue, so that by the time I get to the recommendation that you don't really want to hear, I've made such a strong case that you really can't do much other than pay attention. So that may be the case. Hopefully not too often, but you could be in a position where you need to delay stating your recommendations until the end. All right, so those are the sort of structural and organizational general statements about making recommendations. Now, there's another kind of report that you might be doing as a result of addressing a problem that needs to be solved, or a question that needs to be answered, or an opportunity that needs to be justified. If you are justifying a decision, so this is a decision that's already been made, and your job is to support it. Why has it been made? Right? Or an action has already been taken, and your job is to come up with the evidence to show that it was the best action to take. So if you are doing that, then you have to state up front what you want people to do and why it's needed. Why is it necessary for this decision to have been made, or this action to be taken? So right up front, you're going to be clear that that's what your job is in this report. This is what we're asking you to do. This is why it's important for you to do it. Then, once you ask, then you sort of back up and give a brief background of the problem, or the question, or the opportunity. And now, once you've done that, you get to look at each possible solution, choosing one of those strategies we talked about before, but certainly you're going to be talking about the cost of each solution, the advantages of that solution, the disadvantages of that solution. And then, once you've done that, you summarize what you think is the best solution and the action that's needed to implement it. And then you once again ask for the action you want. So you sort of like circle back around by starting by saying, this is what we need from you, and this is why. And then go through the whole problem solving process that you did, and then come back to asking for the action you want. So let's talk a little more about audience resistance. If you think your audience will be reluctant to take your advice, then once again we go to the problem-solving pattern. That problem-solving pattern is the best, most likely way for you to get people to, if not love what they're hearing, at least accept it. All right? Which means, along with what I've previously described in terms of the organization, you want to use lots of specific examples that you found in your research to show how serious the problem is, so that of course you're requesting that it be solved. All right? You use that sort of structure where you show why an easier alternative or a less expensive alternative to your solution won't work. Right? As we talked about a little before. So it's a great way to get me who's resisting to say, okay, I give up. I'll accept your recommendation because I can see from what you say that the other recommendations are weaker. It would just be easier, it would be less expensive if we went with your recommendation. Or the advantage-disadvantage thing. You show me that there are more advantages to your solution than there are disadvantages, and that there are greater disadvantages to the other solutions. So I have to accept it because I can see that its advantages outweigh its disadvantages. All right? And because I don't want to, I understand that you're not happy with what I'm saying, but I don't want to pick a fight, and I don't want you to feel disrespected. Throughout the report, I keep a neutral and impersonal tone that does not make this about anybody. It's about a problem and a solution to the problem. So just keep a nice, clear, neutral, impersonal tone throughout. And just finish up my sort of general statements with what you'd want to see in any good written business communication. So none of this should surprise you by now. The writing is clear and correct. All right? Information does not get repeated unless absolutely necessary. Keep any repetition to an absolute minimum, and only if it's absolutely necessary that you repeat what you already said. Remember, You've got a lot of readers who just want the bottom line. So the last thing they want is to keep seeing the same information over and over again. They want to know what you recommend, why you recommend it, and why it's the best solution. So don't repeat yourself. Always, always, always introduce and acknowledge any outside sources of information and including any visual information. I'll show you in a minute how you do that, but you must acknowledge sources, just like in a research paper. And that includes visual sources of information. And then you use those. We've talked about document design before. So use your tools in document design to make sure that your writing is clear and attractive to your reader. So make sure you're doing things like using headings for each section of the report, forecasting your topics, in other words, telling me very clearly what you're going to discuss in the next section or sections of the paper. Using good, clear topic sentences, so I don't have to guess about what this paragraph is about. And using good transition words, moving me as your reader from one part of your report to the next with good transition words. Use those tools to make your writing as clear as possible. For formal business reports, you're using a formal writing style. That doesn't mean highfalutin or stilted, but it does mean you're not going to use slang and you're not going to use contractions. You do not write I'll, it's I will. You do not write you'll, it's you will, even though you may not even use those pronouns. You do not write we'd, it's we had. So no contractions and no slang. This could be tricky. Avoid the word you if at all possible when you are addressing your audience. It's better if you can do it to use a company's name. If the person asking you to do this report represents a company, then rather than using that person's name or addressing that person as you keep using the company. So Company X has asked us to generate this report for you. Not the person's name. Okay? Whenever you use any kind of technical terms, always define them and include any documents that your audience will need to fully understand your recommendations. So, for instance, acronyms, abbreviations, you must, it's not that you can't use them, but the first time you use them, you must fully explain them. So you explain them the first time, and then you can use them as acronyms or abbreviations later. So, let's say, I don't know, USO, United Service Organization. You want to use the acronym USO several times during your report, but the first time you use it, you have to fully write it out. So you would say, in introducing that organization, you would say, the United Service Organization, and then parentheses, USO, parentheses. And once you do that, now you can use USO throughout your report without ever having to write it out again. And the same thing goes for abbreviations. Anything you want to abbreviate throughout your report. So it's fine as long as the first time you use it, you write it out fully define and explain it. Then you can go ahead and use it. Make sure that you're giving enough of the history and background of the problem for your reader. Remember, you have to know or try to understand how much your audience already knows about the problem, whether your audience even is fully aware there is a problem. So you'll think about how much history and background do we need to put in the final report based on what the reader already knows and what the reader wants and what the reader expects. Okay? And again, if there are any previous documents that need to be referenced, those are going to go in your appendix. They're going to be part of the back documents that we call appendices. All right. Now, let's get to the actual components of the formal report. First component is your title page. And your title page is not much information, but critical information. Okay, so here's what your title page will have. The title of the report. And this is not anything cute or funsy. This is an informative phrase that tells me what the content of the report is. All right. So you're not trying to impress anybody. You are trying to use the title as a really nice piece of information about the content of the report. Second, the person or organization for whom the report has been prepared. So who is it that asked you to prepare this report? You put that person's name second. Third, the name or names of the person or people who actually wrote the report. So if you're in a team, as you all hopefully will be, you name all the members of the writing team. And in fact, if you can do it and you want to, it's really cool to come up with a team name. So you would first start with the team name, and then you would list the individual names of the members of that team. Okay? And finally, the release date. What is the month, day, and year that you are actually presenting this report as a deliverable to the person who asked you to prepare it? That's the release date. Okay, so that's it for the title page. Title of the report, person who asked for the report, the names of the people who wrote the report, and the release date. So, if that was brief and simple, what comes next is longer and really important and really complex. And that is what we call either a letter or memo of transmittal. And it always comes second after the title page. All right? And if you remember back to many moons ago when we talked about letters and memos, remember that this is going to be a letter if the person you are writing the report for is not part of the organization that you work for. So in other words, if you are not a regular employee of the person asking for this report, then you're going to write this as a letter. If you are a regular employee and it's your supervisor or your boss or someone else within your own company who has asked you to prepare the report, then the transmittal can be done in a memo. So as usual, memo means internal. Letter is used if it's an external audience. All right. Now, this memo or letter of transmittal can be written in a much less formal and more personal style than the actual report. Okay? Because what you're doing is trying to make a friendly connection to the person who asked you to do the report, to create a good image of yourself, to show that you're, once again, that you're credible, and that you tried your best to do what your audience wanted you to do. So you're really just trying to reach out and make a good connection with the person who asked you to generate the report. So it can be a little friendlier than the sound and tone of a formal report. So here's what goes into your letter or memo of transmittal. You begin by stating to whoever it is you're writing to when and by whom the report was authorized. In other words, probably the person reading the letter or memo. So this is the report that you asked us to deliver to you. And you did that because, and then you reiterate what the purpose of the report is. All right? So you start by saying when and by whom the report was authorized and what its purpose was. Okay? The second thing the letter of transmittal does is summarize whatever conclusions and recommendations you are making within the body of the report. Now, some things the letter of transmittal can do, or the memo that can do, that are also very important beyond saying what's in the report. It can draw the reader's attention to anything specifically that you want them to pay attention to. So there may be some section of the report that you think is especially important, So you can say in your letter, we hope you'll pay special attention to the top of page 6, where we tell you about blah, blah, blah. Right? If any problems came up, as long as they're minor problems, while you were doing your research or writing the report, here's where you get to say, this happened, but here's how we dealt with it. And we thank anybody who helped us deal with it. Let's say, I don't know, there was a power outage on the morning that we were ready to merge several documents that we had been working on. So we really thank the tech folks at so-and-so company for helping us out quickly so that we could get right back on track. Something like that. But you always, as long as it's minor, as I said, say what the problem was, say how you dealt with it, which shows how smart and savvy you are, and thank anybody who helped you. If you have been exploring a question or trying to find a solution to a problem, and you feel like you've done the immediate job that needed to be done, but there's still more work to be done in order for a bigger picture, a bigger problem to be solved, a bigger opportunity to be pursued, well, then it's in this memo or letter of transmittal that you say that. That you say, you know, we feel really good about what we've done. We feel like we've come up with some sound recommendations, but we also believe that there are more issues here that need to be resolved, and that we strongly urge you to consider additional research in order to get those issues resolved. Something like that. If there is any. That may not be the case with whatever your project you're working on, but it also might be. Because you may only be doing one small piece of a much larger puzzle to be worked out. And then you thank your audience. You thank your audience for the opportunity to do the work, and then you offer to answer any questions or concerns that the audience might have. And you always make sure that you've provided your contact information. So you leave them feeling good about the fact that they asked you to do this work by thanking them, by saying, we're here if you need anything from us, and here's how to contact us. All right? So a good feeling at the end. So that's your letter of transmission. So you can see that's a pretty important document. It really does set the tone for the whole rest of the report. All right? By telling me why this report was written, what it says, and what more do you need from us. Okay? So now we're into the report itself. First of all, your table of contents. Your table of contents is a list of the parts of the report, and exactly in the order that they appear in the report, and with the headings written exactly as they appear in the report. So, your table of contents is nothing more than a listing of your headings with the page number on which that heading appears. Okay, that's your table of contents. All right? So, if one of your headings is problem, you have problem, page, whatever the page is. And each one in the proper order, written exactly. I can't stress that enough. That in the table of contents must exactly reflect the actual headings and the pages on which they occur. If you don't get that right, I promise you, your reader will be so confused and so turned off. So I promise you the importance of getting that right. And then, here's something you may be less familiar with. Not only do you have to tell me, list the parts of the report in your table of contents, but you also list any illustrations you use. And once again, each of those illustrations, and that could include a table, a graph, a chart, a drawing, an illustration, a photo, anything, any illustration that comes from an outside source needs to be listed, and it needs to be numbered. So number 1, number 2, 3, named and listed in the order in which they appear. All right, so it's sort of like another table of contents, but for illustrations. So each one numbered in order in which they appear. Each one named, each one with the page number. Okay? Okay, so you've got your table of contents, your list of illustrations. Now one more introductory piece, which we call the executive summary, sometimes called an abstract. And you may have seen from your research how abstracts are used, right? And it's basically a very brief statement of what the report is about. So if you're doing a summary abstract, which is probably what you will do in most cases, what you're summarizing is the recommendations and the reasons for those recommendations that you are making. Sometimes, and this would be more like if you're doing library research and you pull up a possible source of information and it's got an abstract, probably it's more likely to be what we call a descriptive abstract, which is again a summary, but it's a summary of the topics discussed within the report and the depth of the discussion of each topic. All right, so it much more describes what the report says, just as in a library database, the abstract describes what a journal article says. All right, so you can go either way. Either you're just summarizing your recommendations, or you're describing basically what the report says. But again, brief summaries, easy to read, concise, clear. Now we're back to very formal writing style. Once again, no contractions, no slang, no use of you. And in fact, it's okay if you use the exact same language in the abstract as you did in the report. No problem there. All we want is a summary of the content of the report. So don't worry, you don't have to change words or say things in different ways. You can use the exact language that you later use in the report. Finally, we've got to the report. All of that stuff that we talked about before, one term we use for that is we call it front matter. In other words, all the stuff that you need to do to lead up to the body. Well, here's the body. Okay, and the body basically looks like a really well organized essay, because it's going to have an introduction. That's where you have your purpose statement that identifies the problem you address, the scope of your work on the problem, the methods you use, the definitions that you need to provide. Now, notice, I hope that this sounds familiar, because if you did a really good job with your proposal to do the work, you've already thought about things like how to talk about the problem, how to talk about the scope of work we are going to do to solve the problem. What are our methods? What are our criteria for success? What definitions? You've already done some of that thinking, at least, when you did your proposal. So hopefully, if you did a good job on the proposal, you've already got stuff to work with here. You're not starting from the very beginning. Same thing with the background. If you need to provide relevant background information to the current situation, you don't want it to go too long. Even if you do have a resistant audience, you still don't want to go on too long. But you do need to decide how much information to use that's relevant to the current situation. Okay. The body is where you not only state what the problem is, but you talk about why it's a problem, if you can. What are the causes of this problem? You present your solutions in one of the many ways that we talked about earlier, many different strategies for presenting solutions. You present your argument for the best solution with all your supporting evidence and data. This is where, because we're now into the longest section with a lot of intense information, this is where you use things like headings, forecasting, and topic sentences to keep your reader moving with you through your thinking. All right? And once again, you might want to go back and look at your proposal. So look at the headings you use there to think about, are these good headings for the report as well? Because really, if you did a good job in the proposal, you've done a lot of the thinking about this structure. So it should look familiar. Okay? And within the body of a report, as needed, you cite your sources and refer to any appendices or visuals. So here you may need to use in-text citations. If you say anything within the report that is a reflection of information that came from outside, then you're going to use in-text citations to say that. And you have to, what you want to do is, if you want me to look at something that's in the appendix, you got to tell me that within the body of the report. So within the report, you'll say, please refer to Appendix A to see a fuller discussion of something or other. Or please refer to Appendix C, where you will find the aggregated data for the survey that we conducted. You know, you're not going to put all that data in the body of the report, but you do want the reader to look at it. So you direct the reader within the body of the report to make sure to look at the appendix. Okay. All right, so that's your body. Lots of stuff there. And if you do a good enough job of it, now you're ready to clearly state your conclusions and your recommendations. All right? So, conclusions, when I use the term conclusions, what I'm talking about is basically summarizing the points you've already made in the report. The conclusions you drew based on what you've already said. So they really are another kind of summary of the points you've already made when you draw conclusions. Whereas recommendations have a slightly further, more extended meaning, because they're actually action items. When you're recommending something, you're usually recommending that someone do something. So they really are action items that you believe through your research will solve or minimize the problem that you're addressing, or will best take advantage of the opportunity that you've been exploring. All right? But whether or not you're summarizing conclusions or you're making recommendations, you never, ever, ever add new information. Again, just like in a well-written essay, in the conclusion, you do not bring in new information. Okay? If you are making multiple recommendations, make sure it's clear that you're multiple by numbering them. All right? So, recommendation 1, do this. Number 2, do that. 3, do this. And, here again, level of resistance. If you think one or more of your recommendations may be hard for your audience to accept, then you're going to add a brief paragraph after you state the recommendation in which to explain. Just very briefly explain the recommendation. And finally, we get to the back of the report. You've now finished the body of your report. What is left are the appendices and the list of references or works cited. So, we've talked about appendices a few times already, but let's go dig a little deeper. First of all, appendices is the plural of the word appendix. So it's one appendix, more than one appendices. And these are completely up to your discretion as the author of the report. This is about any information that you think is too much to actually have within the body of the report, but that you would really like your audience to see. If there is such information, you will create an appendix and put the information in there. So what we're talking about are things like if you had a lot of data, a long or complex set of data, and you analyzed it, and it's your analysis that went into the full report. but you would still like your audience to see that data, then you would make an appendix for it. If part of your data gathering was to interview someone and you recorded and then typed up that interview, your audience might want to see the transcript of the interview. If one way of collecting data that you used was to develop a questionnaire, and then you collected your data and analyzed it, your audience might want to see a copy, just one copy, of the questionnaire to see what kind of questions you asked. Any original source material that you're not going to actually use in full within the body of your report can be put into an appendix. So that's what I'm talking about. Things depending on you and what you think is important in your particular context for the project you're doing. Just information that you think your reader would like to see, but is too much to go into the body of the report. So and those appendices will be numbered. So it's Appendix 1 with a name, Appendix 2 with the name. And by the way, these appendices have to be listed on your table of contents. So after you've listed all the parts of the report, if you have an appendix, it will be Appendix 1, and that appendix will have a name, transcript of interview, and it'll have a page number. All right, so you have to tell me number and name each appendix on your table of contents. Okay? And then finally, last but not least, your list of references or works cited following APA style. So make sure that you've got the conventions of APA style down cold. All right? Because you are going to list every work, every source of information that you used in the order, alphabetical order, and in the style of APA. And make sure that that's your last piece of this complex document that we call a business research report. All right? So, good luck.